the overall layout of how this is going to go is we'll start out, I'll introduce integrated schools, introduce Sharon, and then she is going to start by telling us a little bit about her story. And once that portion is completed, and then we'll get into the discussion part of things. So first of all, I guess everybody can hear me okay. I know we can't see you, which is, is one thing, but in order to get the appropriate amount of people, our integrated schools member, Leonard, was so gracious to let us borrow his webinar version of Zoom. So want to give a big thank you and shout out to him. Also want to shout out to Robin Edwards, who helped with promoting this event, as well as Lindsay Crownhart, who put together some images and things for promoting the event. So, and of course I want to thank Integrated Schools for helping us get all of this together, and we were actually able to take the donations through the Integrated Schools format. So thank you to all who donated. But yeah, so my name is Katie Kissel, and I am a founding board member of the Atlanta chapter of Integrated Schools Organization. And I just want to welcome you all here to our discussion tonight. And I want to tell you just a brief thing about Integrated Schools if you are not familiar. So Integrated School was started as a podcast. You can look it up, you can listen to it in all the places that you listen to podcasts. And it really started this conversation around what does modern integration look like? Because it's been, what is that? 60 years since Brown v. Board, maybe a little bit more than that, 65 years since Brown v. Board, and we are still as segregated today as we were back then. And why is that? And what part do white parents have to play in that? And spoiler alert, it's a lot. But this conversation is starting on a micro level, and it starts with me and you and what we call the playground conversation. And that's what Integrated Schools is about. It's about educating ourselves and making sure that when we are having these discussions about schools on the playground, that we are having discussions that are influenced and backed by fact and not by the smog of what we think or what our neighbor might think, or whatever thing that really, honestly, a lot of that lies on top of a very racist foundation. So in the name of education, I was so excited. Sharon is actually the mother of a friend of mine who is a local Atlanta, Edgewood, East Atlanta resident. We had met a few times, and when I heard about her story, I knew that this is something that we just had to share with the Atlanta community and the Integrated Schools and the community as a whole. So I know we have people from all over the country actually here. So shout out if you could put in the chat just where you're coming from, if you're coming from Atlanta, or I think, I know I see a Sarah Bochting Conrad is, yes, from Chicago. And I know there's a few other people from around the country here. We got some from Baltimore, Chicago, Rome, Georgia, New Jersey. We got people from all over. Hey, Baltimore, I see you. So thank you guys so much for joining us and listening to Sharon tell her incredible story. And I'll let her, I'll hand it over to her for now and put this on mute, and then I'll get back to you guys later. Thank you.
Good evening. It's so good to be with you all this evening. You know, when Katie asked me to do it, I've done this for our League of Women Voters for local people. So, you know, I'm going to tell my story of I was part of the walls that bring the walls down in Spotsylvania County. And we'll talk a little bit about those walls that still remain. You know, when I had my 9-year-old birthday party, it was the happiest day that I can remember. My entire third grade class, they walked to my house and we played, we had ice cream and cake and we opened presents and the entire class was there. Well, the reason they were there is because I lived right across the field from the John J. Wright Consolidated School. You see, my third grade teacher, Miss Alberta Fry, she had been a classmate of my mom, and the cafeteria workers were members of my church. The custodian staff were distant relatives, and the school was like family. John J. Wright Consolidated School was named after a very prominent educator in the area. It was an all-black high school in Spotsylvania County. I know you saw from that map exactly where Spotsylvania County is. It's becoming a suburb of DC, but it's right in the part of the state. So John J. Wright was grades 1 through 12, and it was built by an organization of black churches. Before that, the regular public schools did not afford black students to go to school unless they had their own. So the churches donated lots of hard-earned nickels and dimes, and they bought land, and they brought bricks. They paid off the bank loans, and they helped with the teachers' salaries. Now, the county paid the teachers' salaries, but it was a much lower rate than the white teachers got. Now, the teachers and the staff at John J. Wright, they were excellent educators, in spite of them having lots of leftover materials and supplies from the white school. But there was a caring and supportive environment for the students, and there was a firm push to excel. There was no excuse that you wouldn't at least try your best. It was a cherished and honored institution of learning, and in spite of the unequitable support, the graduating students would go on to become judges, lawyers, doctors, nurses, educators, and brave members of our armed forces and successful members of the community. Now, the walls of segregation were invisible to me, but they weren't invisible to my parents and 6 other parents. As members of the local NAACP, they knew that Spotsylvania was slow to follow the law of the land. You know, the Brown versus the Board of Education that gave the freedom of choice plans to all localities in 1954. Our parents knew that their tax dollars were being spent on schools, but they were not equally allocated. The books were not the same. The science lab materials were not the same. The upkeep and the age of the buses weren't the same. There was no equal but separate education in Spotsylvania County. So that summer of 1963, during my 9-year-old birthday party, our parents decided to get in the way of segregation. You know, like our late Congressman John Lewis, they decided to get in good trouble. And they submitted applications for 4 young girls to attend Robert E. Lee Elementary and 3 young ladies to attend Spotsylvania High School. Those applications were submitted to the State Pupil Placement Board in Richmond, Virginia. That's who decided who went to what school. Now, it's recalled that when the applications were submitted to the PPB, they initially weren't even accepted because they had all been typed on the same typewriter. Well, you see, my cousin Amy P. Jordan, she was a retired college professor and an active member of the NAACP. She had met with our parents and had helped to complete the applications on her typewriter. So with persistence, they resubmitted the applications. The applications were accepted and we were assigned to attend the white school in the fall of 1963. And so my 9th birthday party in June of '63 would be the last time my elementary school class could walk to my house. It would be several years later that I would be taught by a teacher who looked like me, or even see a cafeteria worker that knew me. But at 9 years old, I was sure my main concern when I was told that I would be attending Robert E. Lee Elementary was who's going to be my friends. So when I was told that Karen, Moselle, and Cassandra, my 3rd grade classmates, they would be attending with me, that's all I needed to know. I don't remember having much thought about going to the white school, as long as I could be in the class with my friends. But I do remember being told these 4 things by my mama. Be a good girl, make good grades, represent your family well. And if I was called names, don't say anything back. Just tell your mama when you get home. Now, those first 3 instructions, they were the same instructions I'd always been told about going to school. You know, you always had to make good grades. You had to be good. And of course, you had to represent your family well. But it was that last instruction that was new to me. And I thought, what name would I be called if it's not going to be my name? So my dad, who was in the military, he tells me that he had been transferred to Germany in 1963 before school started. He told me that he had warned his supervisors that if there was any disturbances with the integrated process or his daughter was facing any trouble, he would leave Germany immediately and come back to Spotsylvania. My dad said he was on standby for that first day of school. So on August 29th, 1963, the county enrolled the first Negroes, as the article read in the newspaper. Myself, Karen Williams, Moselle Taylor, and Cassandra Johnson, all 4th graders, Rita Pillington, 8th grader, and Charlene Pillington and Elizabeth Taylor were both 11th graders. We brought down the wall of segregation in Spotsylvania County. But there were many walls that came down that year. You know, one of the books I recommend reading, and I've read A Girl Stands at the Door, The Generation of Young Women Who Desegregated American Schools by the author Rachel Devlin. She writes that laws pertaining to school segregation noted the unassimilability of Black children. The belief was that school desegregation would plunge the white children into moral or intellectual chaos, and it would seriously jeopardize their health. Perhaps that was my thinking, that was the thinking, and why there was a wall of fear in 1963. The long bus ride. You know, the county assigned 1 bus to transport 7 children to school. The bus started at one end of the county, and it traveled over 25 miles, almost 2 hours, to pick all 7 of us up. Miss Louise Dixon, who was our beloved bus driver, she was always reassuring that we would be all right. And we were excited because at least we were on the bus together. So after dropping off the 3 high schoolers, the bus took us to Robert E. Lee, and we got off. I remember being escorted into the auditorium, and we sat together. The other students, the white students, they were in classrooms with their teacher, and I remember I was still sitting there. So after all the other students had left, I was escorted to my classroom alone by the principal. Upon arriving at my class, told me not to sit next to no nigger. The quiet classroom got even quieter, and Miss Strum, in her high-pitched, stern voice, said, "That word will never be used in this classroom again, and she will sit where I tell her to sit." So I quickly walked to my seat. relieved that my teacher was in control of the class and she would protect me in this classroom. But now I knew why my mom gave me that fourth instruction. Perhaps the most remembered wall was the wall of social isolation. My mom could tie the prettiest, most beautiful ribbons, and my hair was always neatly separated into two pigtails with bows on the end, and the bows always matched my dresses. But I remember feeling so different when I went to the bathroom with the other girl classmates. They were always combing their hair and changing the style of their hair from braids to ponytails to hair hanging down their back. And there was such conversation about hair in the bathroom, but not to me. No one said anything to me about my hair, how pretty my bows were, nothing. And I knew that if I undid my hair from those braids, I'd have lots of explaining to do when I got home. So I went to the bathroom quickly, and I came out to get back in the line. Now, of course, that was not easy either, because when you stood in line with the other students, the more times you stood there, the more times you were called names, mostly by the boy students. They were whispering so the teacher would not hear them. Nigger, coon, monkey. Some even held their nose as if I smelled unpleasant. Recess wasn't much better. I mean, back then we had the old-fashioned recess, where the entire class went out the play yard. It wasn't a playground, it was just a field with kickballs, and we were just told to play. No instructions, just play. I'd just walk around hoping that the other classes would come out so I could see maybe Karen or Moselle or Sandy, but at least then I wouldn't have to be alone. But if not, I just walked around by myself. I remember lunchtime at John Jay Wright. When we went through that cafeteria line, the workers spoke to you by the name. They spoke to you by your name. They asked how your mama was. They told you how pretty your dress was or how nice your hair looked. But the cafeteria at R.E. Lee was another lonely place. Most of the time I'd buy my lunch and go through the lunch line, but there were no affirmations, no hellos. I didn't know them and they didn't know me. Ice cream was purchased separately, and I remember I always had that extra dime from my mom to get ice cream on Fridays, and I loved the chocolate milk, something I don't even remember having at John Jay Wright. So as the year went on, I noticed the wall of incorrect and untold history. Some of you may remember November the 22nd, 1963. I do. Miss Bernard, the principal, she came on the loudspeaker and she announced that our president, President John Kennedy, had died. I remember that day vividly as school was dismissed early and it was even canceled for a few days. I remember thinking that President Kennedy was the president for civil rights, because that's what I'd heard my mom and everybody talk about. And in my 9-year-old mind, I thought if he was dead, then that meant I couldn't go back to Robert E. Lee because everything would change now. And that's what 9-year-olds think about. But of course that didn't happen. And after days of mourning, school resumed and my school year continued. The miseducation was from my history books also. The history books always had pictures of Black enslaved people working in the fields with white people standing over them with guns. So the close-up pictures of the Black people in the history books showed them smiling as if they were having a good time. I remember being taught that the Civil War was fought because the North wanted to stop the slaves from having a good time. And General Robert E. Lee fought so the slaves could continue to have a good time. Slaves could continue to have housing and food, and that's why the school was named after him, and his picture was hung in the front hallway. There was no mention of injustice or inequality or enslavement. That was the way it was. Thanksgiving was always taught from the Pilgrim perspective. Of course, in the Thanksgiving play, I could portray an Indian, but never a Pilgrim, and never Pocahontas. Because you see, we were taught John Smith was white and I was black. So Pocahontas had to hug John Smith, and that couldn't be done. Couldn't be that way. The Christmas play, yeah, that was when schools had religious celebrations. They were allowed. I could play an animal in the manger, but I couldn't be Mary or an angel. Then there was the wall of exclusion. So even though I integrated Robert E. Lee School that year, there were still organizations that continued to ban or not allow Black girls. I was so excited when the announcement was made that all girls interested in joining the Girl Scouts had to take a permission slip home and have it signed. The meeting would be held at the local extension office. God, my mom signed that form and arrangements were made to pick me and Karen and Moselle and Cassandra up after the meeting. All the girls were buzzing about the Girl Scouts, and I was excited too. So after school, we walked to the extension building after, and we had our signed permissions forms, and we were told at the door that us 4 Black girls had to wait. So we saw the leader. She was letting the other girls in, but not us. We knew what that meant. It was canceled for us, but not for all the other white girls that were already inside. Daisy Lowe, the founder of Girl Scouts, she had a vision that all girls could be Scouts. But she also feared that an official position that included colored girls as Scouts would make the Southern troops quit. So she left that decision up to the state and the local councils. And the local council in Spotsylvania that year decided that the troop would not be integrated. And finally, there was the wall of stereotypes. You know, the stereotype that Black students were not as smart as white students, and they would plunge the white children into moral and intellectual chaos. Well, that was proven wrong. That wall was quickly taken down. Do you remember the SRA reading kits with different colors for the different levels? I think today they would be called kind of like independent reading. So the goal was to read the passage. It was fiction or nonfiction, and each of them was on a different colored card. You had to improve your comprehension and continue to read at a higher and higher level. And after you read it, then you had another card that would have multiple choices questions on it, and you would answer those questions and then check your answers against the answer card. This was all on the honor system, and we didn't have this at John Jay Wright School. So I remember my mom's instructions to get good grades, and I took this reading program seriously. I was determined to get to the highest reading level. That wasn't a difficult task because my 2nd grade teacher and my 3rd grade teacher at John Jay Wright, they had taught me how to read and write and spell. So it was at that SRA box that I remember being spoken to by my classmates. What color are you on? And I could proudly say gold, or it may have been silver, but I know I was on one of the highest colors in the box. The stereotype that was so different that we were so different that we couldn't assimilate, that was also wrong. Because, you know, at Robert E. Lee, they had an annual Jamestown field trip. Everybody knows, regardless of where you live, you know Jamestown was where those ships came in the first time it was discovered. And we all, the state all took 4th graders, that is the 4th graders from the white schools. They took them to Jamestown. Now this field trip was for everybody, but I know there was some discussion about whether we would be able to go because Jamestown may not have been allowing integrated classes to attend. But the decision was made that we would be able to go. And now the big decision was who would sit next to who. That was the big question. So I remember Miss Shrum put that chart in the back of the classroom with everybody's name on it, and then you had to sign up who you're going to sit next to. Well, no one signed by my name. So I remember thinking, if I don't get a partner, I'm not going to be able to go on this field trip. See, Karen and Moselle and Cassandra, they were in another class, and that class was going to be on another bus. So who was going to be my partner? I mean, who was going to be with me as we walked around Jamestown? So Carolyn Jones, she was a classmate. She asked me if I wanted to be her partner, sit next to her on the bus. And God, I was so relieved. I said, yeah, I want to go to Jamestown. And now I knew I could go. So we continued to talk to each other up until the field trip, and we shared which reading color we were on the SRA box, and we even agreed to trade lunches on that Jamestown trip. Finally, I felt like I had a friend. So the morning of the trip, my mom packed me a bag lunch, leftover Sunday dinner fried chicken, and a generous slice of my grandma's pound cake. I remember the joy I felt knowing that I could talk to someone on the bus and I'd have a partner for the whole trip. So we settled in our seats, and Carolyn said, I still wanted to trade lunch. And I said, of course, anything, because I had a friend. So she said, what'd you bring? And I proudly said, fried chicken sandwich and a big slice of grandma's homemade pound cake. Carolyn said, wow, that sounds good. And then I asked, what did you bring? And she gleefully answered, a peanut butter and banana sandwich and some cookies. I swallowed hard and I repeated, a peanut butter and banana sandwich? And Carolyn said, yeah, it is so good. So I handed over my chicken lunch for a peanut butter and banana sandwich. And I enjoyed every bite of that sandwich. Spotsylvania County schools would become fully integrated by 1968. John J. Wright became a middle school from 1968 to 2008. And after extensive renovations and modernizations, the doors reopened as the John J. Wright Educational and Cultural Center was open. Now, they wanted to change the name of the building, but the Black community in Spotsylvania spoke out strongly to assure that the name John J. Wright would remain. Today, it offers educational services for Spotsylvania counties from pre-K right through 12th grade. It also houses the John J. Wright Museum. It's a wonderful museum with a timeline of historic events and displays of artifacts about the education of the Black community in Spotsylvania. If you're ever in the area, because we're right between Richmond and Washington, D.C., if you're ever in that area, stop by for a visit. Or you could just visit them on their website, the John J. Wright Museum. I was in and out of Spotsylvania schools because as an Army brat, my dad was transferred to different bases. So after attending middle school in Stuttgart, Germany, I returned back to Spotsylvania for the 9th grade, remembering all my elementary schoolmates and getting reacquainted with my John J. Wright classmates. Sometime I found myself as an outsider though, because my John J. Wright classmates, some of them accused me of leaving them behind when I went to the white school. My senior year, 1972, was the same year Shirley Chisholm sought the nomination for President of the United States. I was elected class secretary. Karen was elected class president. I was also the first Black majorette, twirling fire, no less. Our class was the first to have a Black homecoming king, Vincent Tyler, and our football captains were Black seniors. Remember, we had all started elementary school with the students by this time that were seniors. Out of 45 teachers at Spotsylvania High School, 3 of them looked like me. We cherished their presence and support, Ms. Fry, Ms. Harper, and Ms. Sample. So we brought down those walls of segregation. We conquered those walls of fear, isolation, exclusion, miseducation, and stereotypes. But you know, I'm sure you will agree that there are still walls that remain in Spotsylvania County, Virginia schools, and I bet you they're still up there in Atlanta, Georgia. So there's walls of quality education. I have stats for Spotsylvania County. Today it has 17 elementary schools. Back then it was only one. There's 7 middle schools and 5 high schools, and all the schools are accredited by the state. The school district is 53% white, 18% black, and 17% Hispanic. And according to the Virginia State Quality Profile for 2018-19, the reading and math proficiency scores are at least 20 points lower for the black students in Spotsylvania and also across the state of Virginia. Schools with high percentages of students of color are 7 times more likely to have teachers with less than 3 years of experience or provisionally licensed teachers. There's a wall of dropouts. This is Virginia statistics. The dropout rate for black students are 3 times the rate of white students, according to statistics for 2019. Why? Why does this happen? There's a wall of expectation. 60% of white students graduate with advanced diplomas, compared to only 35% of black students. Why? There's the wall of suspensions. 22% of all Virginia students are black, but black students account for 55% of suspensions and 41% of all expulsions. We've all heard of that school suspension to the prison pipeline. This has to stop. And then there's the wall of lack of opportunity. The most recent statistics, the nationwide college graduation rate for black students stands at an appalling low rate of 42%. This figure is 20 points below the 62% rate for white students. That's college graduations. The good news is that for the first time in 40 years, the percentage of black students 18 to 24 years old with a high school credential is almost the same as that of white peers. That's according to the National Center of Education Statistics. But there's still a racial gap that remains for that on-time diploma at 18. There's that wall of diverse curriculum. Students of color are still denied the opportunity to see the positive reflections of themselves and their identities that white students are granted. In some school districts, 8 out of every 10 books that students are likely to see in their class from preschool to 8th grade are written by white authors. Students should be introduced to texts by black authors that speak to black experiences, the black perspectives, and their black accomplishments. How can we promote the academic excellence of black children without introducing them to black intellectual individuals as they see themselves becoming one day? Hopefully you've seen or heard of or perhaps read Dr. Beverly Daniel Tatum's book, Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria? She writes this: I think students of color really need to see themselves reflected in positive ways in the curriculum. And that probably sounds very obvious, but the fact is that that's too often they don't see themselves reflected in the curriculum. When and how they see themselves reflected is so important though. Students of color need to see themselves represented not just as victims, but as agents of their own empowerment. And there are lots of ways to do that. You can talk about Sojourner Truth, you can talk about Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass, and so on. And now we can talk about so many more. I think white students need to be helped to understand too how racism operates. Evidently, when you talk about racism in a predominantly white society, you generate that feeling of discomfort and often guilt among white people because they might feel that you're saying that white people are bad. So what do? In these discussions, we need to include examples of white people as agents of change. Teach students about the abolitionists. Teach students about Virginia Foster Durr, who was so active during the civil rights movement. All children need to learn about these white folks who worked against oppression. And unfortunately, many white students don't have that information either. And that big wall that we have now, that big wall of COVID-19, this present pandemic, the school closures that were caused by COVID have additional aspects of trauma to students. There's losses of resources, loss of opportunities to learn, to go well beyond the traditional summer break. Children from more affluent communities, they're more likely to come from families with financial resources, stable employment, and flexible hours to work from home, and childcare arrangements that will allow them to weather this storm. But this pandemic for families is it's not easy for families who are renting their housing, working in low pay fields that are hit hardest by the economic impacts. Norfolk Public Schools reported that Black students accounted for 71% of the students that received an incomplete grade for the spring semester while they were virtual learning. There was no way of accountability of why they weren't logging on. So I'm often asked how I feel about being the first or a trailblazer. So as an adult, I understand why my parents made that decision, that they had to integrate the Spotsylvania schools. And as a parent, my husband and I have had to make those same tough decisions to assure that our children got a quality education. And I'm grateful to my parents and the community for their vision, that they took down that wall of segregation. They demand equality. They demand fairness. And they demanded opportunity for all the students. You know, our past had walls that are still walls today. Our past history is our present. Thank you to Integrated Schools for allowing me to tell my story. Katie sent some questions, but I don't know how you want to handle this. But thank you for the invitation.
Thank you so much, Sharon, and I appreciate you so much. I know that everybody is clapping. I wish I could turn on everyone's mic because I know they're clapping right now just to hear your story. And yes, I see virtual applause in the chat right now. So thank you for that. And yeah, I do have some questions. So guys, so this is where I'm going to kind of turn it over to you a little bit. If you have questions, please put it in the chat. I have some here that I'm going to ask Sharon as well, but we can kind of integrate, see what I did there? We can kind of integrate some of your questions as well as some of the ones that I've kind of have prepared for us. So the first thing I want to ask, because I think this is a question that a lot of people want to know, is what were the questions that you asked your parents when you were old enough to realize the impact of their decision to send you to an all-white school?
Yeah, you know, it didn't really hit me until my oldest son, Anthony, started school. And as a parent of a child who was going to school, I just had those feelings of how could anyone do that to their child, to put them in a situation where they would be so lonely. It was those, for me, that sense of loneliness and that sense of being protected that brought back those memories. So that's the first time I talked to my parents about it. I mean, that was a good, I don't know, 20, 25, 30 years after it happened. And I remember my mom saying, she said, well, they said it was the best thing, and we agreed that we would do it. The other thing that I noticed is that my father was in the military, 3 other were in the military, and a couple of other parents were in business for themselves. So the risk to them as parents in this small community of losing their jobs for bucking the system and taking down that wall were very minimum, because they weren't the bosses. So she said that when they were asked about sending me, and we were related, some of us were, that they said yes. Remember, we also had lived, my dad had traveled all over the world, and we had in other times lived on bases that were already integrated, and then we would come back and live in a segregated society. So she kind of went with the flow, didn't think that she was doing what was best for. I knew I would be protected, but I went through a period of being very angry and thinking I'd never do that to my child. But I understood as I got older, and as I start recognizing what the choices that we have to make as parents, I understood that sometimes those choices are not easy, and they are done for the benefit of the greater good. And that's what my parents did, and I'm very glad that they did that. I'm glad that they did.
Thank you so much. So we have a question from Donnie Jones, who lives in Kirkwood here in Atlanta, and she has actually 2 questions. Okay. So the first one is, and these are both about the girl who sat next to you on the bus. First one is, did she like your chicken as much as you liked her peanut butter and banana sandwich?
The great thing about Carolyn is we remained friends right up through high school. She always sat at the cafeteria table, because it was true that all the Black kids sit together in the cafeteria. But because we'd known each other from elementary, she did continue to sit with us. And then, of course, we lost contact with each other. But thank goodness to Facebook. And one day I typed in her name, and lo and behold, she pops up, and then we message, are you the same Carolyn Jones? Because, of course, we're married now. That went to R.E. Lee, and she said, yes, she is a Lutheran minister. I knew she had a calling on her life back then. And she tells a story of why, yes, she did like the fried chicken, to answer your question. But she also told me something, that we just had a reunion about 5 years ago when they did the reunion of all of us. She also came from Nebraska at that time to be with us. She tells a story of her mother, who lived on a farm in North Carolina, and her grandmother was a teacher, and she taught the sharecroppers. And there was one Black family that was a sharecropper. And so, the question was, well, she said, no, those kids are going to be taught too. And the white parents were like, well, I don't know. She says, of course, those children need to be educated. So Carolyn's mother went to elementary school with a Black child. She didn't think it was anything big deal, because they all lived on the farm and they all went to school together. So this was kind of planned, even though Carolyn talks about her father being very, very prejudiced and racist and saying things to her about that day. But yes, we remained friends, and I had a peanut butter and banana sandwich today.
Oh my goodness, what a great story.
Yeah, it is.
Oh God, it makes me cry. I'm glad I didn't cry this time. I cried the last time I heard your story, but I didn't cry this time, so that's good. But yeah, that's an amazing story. And the funny thing is, she asked about the sandwich, and then her follow-up question was, did you two stay friends? So you already answered that. That's so fantastic. Yeah. Okay, the next question we have here is, do you feel that there is hope for our education system to be truly integrated?
Yeah, and I'm glad you gave me these questions before, because it really did help me, to just think about these things a little bit more. And so, first of all, yeah, there is hope. And it is because of work like the integrated schools. I mean, you all are working to educate and to practice the anti-racist school things that we know works in school integration. So what's happening, and I did some research. You know, there's a guy, Robert C. Johnson. I got to read this book. It's called Children of the Dream: Why School Integration Works. And I just found out about this book. He focused on those of us adults who were born between 45 and 68, which includes me, and he followed us up until 2013. And we all were part of that dream of integration. And so what he found at the end of that study was that we were all between 45 and 68 at the time he was doing this. And he found that Black adults who were integrated in schools were associated with increased educational and career attainment beyond high school. We had higher lifetime earnings, a decreased risk of incarceration, and even better health. Now, other studies have shown that the increased comfort for people from different backgrounds extended beyond high school, including the fact that, you know, we felt prepared to participate. But this benefit wasn't only for the Black students, it was also beneficial for white students also that were there. So yeah, I do have hope because, you know, we stopped this whole integration thing was only for about 15 years that we forcefully integrated, that we did the busing to assure that schools were equally integrated. It then stopped, and so many, it went back to court, and places like Norfolk said we didn't have to integrate anymore. And so we're reaping that long-term effect, consequences of segregation. You know, this surges of racial prejudice and racial intolerance and polarization of political attitudes and unprecedented economic inequality. It's a direct product, I think, of inequality. And this is also, you know, written and people have talked about it. So we got to have hope because we don't want to stay in this position anymore. We don't want this polarization and things that are happening because we have allowed resegregation to come back.
Well, we have a few more questions from the audience here. So we'll start with Amy. She said she wanted to know if you or others in your community ever regretted the loss of Black schools and that community where excellence was expected and the staff and faculty were close to the community. It says whether you wish the courts had forced equitable funding of those schools instead of integration.
In my other reading, it talks about when there was a plan for integration. The plan, and this again is what Robert C. Johnson did, the plan had three things that all came in together. There was preschool, let me find those notes. There was the fact that we had Head Start, so that meant early education. Mm-hmm. And there was adequate funding of schools, and there was integration. It was those three things that we saw our public education excel. It wasn't one without the other. So we could say, no, we needed to just put more into that, you know, into segregated schools. No, the reason it worked is because we had good education, early education. We had, you know, the fact that we had integration, and we also had adequate funding. And some of that has been siphoned away, you know, from schools. So, huh?
I said some of it or all of it.
Yeah, yeah. So as far as the regret, no. Now remember, I was 9 years old. So it's all that I remember as far as always being, because after we left, after, you know, we went other places, I also went to a predominantly white college. I tell you what I did get. I got that confidence and that comfort with people from different backgrounds. No longer was I was so used to being one of the only, that didn't bother me anymore. I knew I belonged. I've been doing this since I was 9 years old. I was prepared to participate with the diverse people of culture, of anyone. And this was from the time I was 9 up till now. You know, I was assured that I had a seat at that table. I knew that my education was adequate. I knew that I had everything because I had seen it. Remember those walls we took down? And I also appreciated my culture, and I appreciated the culture of others. All those stereotypes, I could bust them wide open. Like white kids are smarter. I knew that wasn't true all the time. Black kids are not. I knew that wasn't true. I knew those were stereotypes. They were not they were generalizations. We were all people. We were all striving.
Thank you, Sharon. I appreciate that. The next question we have is from Sarah. She says, do you know if after seeing you and the other children begin attending this school, were there other Black families that followed suit?
Oh, definitely. Yes. The next year, there was, so it started with 4 of us in 4th grade and 3 in high school. The next year, it doubled. And boys came. Remember, the 7 of us that went that year were all girls. There were 2 boys that were supposed to go, and I'm not sure. I want to talk to their mother, and I need to do that quickly. But I want to talk to the mother of why they decided not. There is some literature out there that talks about how girls were expected to do this because we could handle the whole stuff that was going to be put on us, and we wouldn't be as quick to let it go. And we also knew that sometimes girls were accepted in society as a whole, and the boys had so much put on them, they didn't want to start it so young. But the next year, boys came, and then it continued all the way up. Now, Spotsylvania itself, as I said, it was only like 23% Black anyway, but yes, it continued. And by 68, so this was in 63, but by 68, all the schools integrated. All the schools were totally integrated by that time.
Thank you. Lindsay says, I'm curious about your opinion on changing the name of Robert E. Lee Elementary School. Also, side note, being in education myself, but mostly taught in the North, your history that you learned about Robert E. Lee blows my mind. So
yeah, it did us too. And even though here in Virginia, there's a whole curriculum in 4th grade, because that was the same grade I did, where they do the whole thing about, and believe me, it's changed a lot. So they no longer are saying that. So I don't know. What I understand, and because I don't live there, I live here in Norfolk, but what I do, someone has told me that there is discussions at the local, at the school board meetings, but Spotsylvania has its first board of, she is the first board of supervisor, the first Black woman on that board. She's the first elected this year in all these years. So, she also can really champion this. Yes, and the other thing I found out is that, along with a lot of the statues and the naming of public things, they weren't always named that. This was called Spotsylvania Elementary School, the same way it was Spotsylvania High School, because it was the only, elementary for that area. But somewhere along the line, the decisions were made to raise up these Civil War heroes. And Spotsylvania is a big place for the Civil War mementos and stuff, to raise them up and give them that name. And yeah, I think that's when the name changed. It was back in the early 50s that the name changed to Robert E. Lee.
Yeah, which goes along with a lot of civil rights or Confederate, not civil rights, Confederate monuments were definitely mostly put up in the 20th century.
Yeah.
So that's very interesting. We have another question from MT. It says, thanks so much. What would you say to current parents that have children in not so much integrated schools, majority still white, and there could be more minorities coming to the school due to redistricting, and they not seeing their outrage of this as racism? So I think what she's saying is there are parents who are not liking the redistricting but they don't view that outrage of theirs as racism. What would you say to that?
So does this go along with the question you said that you had asked before, Katie? What would I say?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, let's loop this one in. So I asked the question, if you could ask the white parents on this call to do one thing to further racial equity in our schools, what would it be?
Yeah. So I've thought about that, and so a little bit. So the one thing I mean, there's multiple things, and of course we could have this discussion. I so appreciate having it tonight. But I would say becoming a part of the school community, seeing the benefit of all the children in the school. Because remember, we are only as good as, the parts of us and our society. I know when we look and see what things are going on today in our society, it just hits us because we're thinking, I'm not like that. But remember what other people see, especially people from abroad. What they see is not us individually, they see us as a country. And I think the same thing can happen as a school. I think we become part of that community. We already know the benefits of integration. It's all out there. You can find it all over the place. The benefit for white students, the benefit for Black students. I think that if you know that you're involved in that school, and you're there for all the students, and you're not judging the parents that are not there, because they have reasons of why they're not there. They may not be our reasons, but we're there to help each student in that school. And I get it. I had 4 children, and we had to constantly be juggling, and we moved, and whenever we moved, we'd hear about, oh, that's not the best school, you may not want to be sending your kids to that school. And I listened to the podcast, and if you haven't, I'm sure most of you all have, of nice white parents, nice white people, nice white parents. And I just listened to that more in the last couple of days, and boy, did it bring back memories. Because when Anthony did start school, our oldest, and Kelly, when they started, Norfolk had gone back to resegregation. They stopped the busing. And so the school that my kids attended was in a very affluent neighborhood. And they did bus the children in. Well, once they stopped busing, the parents around the school told the principal, well, we'll send our kids now to the school, the local school. So the principal asked me, she was a Black principal, if I would meet with some parents. And all this came back to me today because it was bringing up such a different feeling. And she wanted me to convince the parents that were threatening of whether I will send my kids to your school or not, or keep them out. She wanted me to convince them. And so there was a meeting set up. And you know where the meeting was? It wasn't in the school. And I remember this so plainly. It was me and another Black parent. It was in one of the homes. Beautiful home. Boat ramp out back. No offense. She was a wonderful person, this woman was. But they didn't want to come to the school to talk to us. And of course I can only talk about myself. I felt like, well, do I belong with you? Or are you trying to tell me what you are? I just couldn't figure out why we couldn't be in the school for this meeting. But then I learned, because the PTA was formed, and some of the parents were on the committee, and we had more meetings on the phone. We didn't have any of this chat or anything. We had more meetings outside of the meetings than we ever had at the PTA meeting. And they were always about different teachers and things that happened at the school. And I got caught up. I got caught up as a Black parent, listening to who the good teachers were, who the teachers that weren't very good, and not have your child. And they accepted me as somebody who really wanted what was best for my child, because all parents did. We just may go about it in a different way. But these group of parents, white parents, accepted me of what, we're going to do things this way. And I got caught up in it. And I remember requesting a certain teacher for my 5th grade student, Anthony, and I didn't get it. And I was devastated, because what I had heard was that this teacher was mean, and she didn't do things. What she didn't do was let these parents run her classroom. She knew, she had been teaching for a long time. She knew what students needed. And Anthony was, that kind of child that needed to be pushed a little bit. And she just told us, let me be the teacher at school, you be the parent. It was the best teacher he could have had that year, the very best. And so I just know that those conversations get going. And that's why I love what integrated schools do. You all talk about that. You bring it up to the front. You talk about your fears. You talk about your misgivings. And they may not be, you may not think that they are rooted in racism. And it's not that but remember, our whole society is rooted in racism. We have systemic racism in this country. So it is very unlikely that the things that we think do not have that layer on it. But you've given yourself an avenue to put those things out there and talk to each other about it. And that's why I think it's such a great organization that's happening. I didn't know about it. I didn't know about this organization.
Well, I tell you what, I think this has been fabulous. And I so much appreciate hearing your story, Sharon. And I think your answers to the questions have really given me something to think about. And I hope for some of the rest of the people. Now, just want to point out that for some of you, if you guys hadn't checked out the chat, there are some links that have been posted in the chat. One of my fellow board members of the Atlanta chapter of Integrated School has been posted some links. She was mentioning that what you're talking about, that parent communication that you're talking about, Integrated Schools has a word for that. We call that the smog. We call that the smog. You gotta wade through the smog to get to the meat and potatoes of what education is, and kind of push all that smog to the side and focus on the facts. So yeah, please. And I know Amy has put a link to A Girl Stands at the Door, a link to a couple other things in the chat, and also a link to the podcast Nice White Parents. So with that being said, I had us going until 9. We're 7 minutes over, but I'm just so engaged. Is there any last final comments that you have, Sharon, before we head off for the evening?
I did some looking back at what Horace, where did I put that? Anyway, as I look back and look at public schools, we know that Horace Mann believed in public education for all children. That was going to be the great equalizer of our democracy. That's where we're going to learn. And so his idea of education for all children, and then we get in there and mess it up and move it aside and have certain education for some kids and not others. But I think if we get back to the basics, that this is the only thing that's mandated in our society. We don't mandate where people live. There are laws about discriminating against it, but I'd love coming to you all to Atlanta now and seeing such integration in some parts. But we also know that there's no way you can make that happen. But school, you can make happen. You can make it happen that children from all walks of life, from all colors and all cultures, can be in that same classroom together, learning from each other. That's what's going to save our democracy, is to continue that and not go off into our corners. So I applaud you all for what you're doing, and I thank you for that. And that's something that I'm going to continue hoping that my generations will continue. I know it wasn't all for naught. We did it so that we could be right where we are today.
Well, thank you so much. And I also just want to say a special shout out, because I know your daughter is on the call as well. Thank you, Kelly, for lending us your mom for the evening. And thank you to all of our participants and all those who asked questions. And just if I may do one last plug for integrated schools, we have a Facebook group, if you're not familiar with, it's called Integrated Schools Atlanta Chapter. There's also, for those of you who are not in Atlanta or in other parts, there's local chapters for most major cities in the United States. If there isn't a chapter, you can start one. Also, there is an overall integrated schools Facebook group and Facebook page that you can follow. And you can also, again, check out the podcast wherever you get your podcasts from. And listen and educate yourself. And there's a few things you can do if you go to the integratedschools.org. You go to their website, there's a few things you can find on there. There's good book recommendations. There's also, you can take the 2-tour pledge, which basically says that before you make any judgments about where or where not your kid is going to school, that you at least tour 2 schools in your area, and you use that as your kind of your measuring stick, as opposed to just paying attention to the smog. So, you know, that's just one of many things that we can do as a community to help promote this idea and make sure that integrated schools is something that we don't stop talking about, that we continue to push for. So thank you guys. Thank you, Sharon, so much.
Welcome. Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. Goodbye. Thank you, Atlanta. Thank you. Appreciate it.